Thank you very much, Alita. And thank you, Tarek, for your opening presentation, a really good setup for the day. So hi, everyone. My name is Curtis Jessop, and I'm a Research Director at the National Centre for Social Research. And as Lisa said, today I'll be talking about a project looking at public attitudes to linking survey and Twitter data. Before I'd start, I'd just like to make a few acknowledgements. This work was all funded under an ESRC grant and is part of a larger project I'm undertaking with Luke, Tarek and Matt. And I'd also like to acknowledge my NatSen colleagues, Nehal, Natasha, Sophie and Josh, who did a lot of the fieldwork and analysis for this strand of the project. In this presentation, I'm only going to have time to go through the surface of the summing of the findings from this strand of the project. I'll start by giving a little bit of a background and summarizing the methodology we used before talking through our experience chronologically. So our initial findings after one round of interviews with the public and the changes we made as a result of that, and then the initial findings and conclusions after both rounds. So to get us started, what are we trying to do and why? As I think Tarek really outlined quite well for us, as with other forms of data linkage, survey data can really benefit from additional data covering areas not included in the original questionnaire, perhaps because of their complexity or due to space limitations. At the same time, social media data can benefit from the structure and direction of survey data. For example, we can begin to analyze how the social media data vary between different groups of interest, such as age or income groups, assuming that information is collected in the survey. So for example, I piloted this approach in 2017 around the UK general election, and the survey data I had gave me lots of reported information about attitudes to policies, and so on and so forth. But Twitter data really added a load of texture. It told me what people were actually talking about, who they were talking with, and where they were getting their information from. Similarly, by linking the survey data onto the social media data, I could analyze the conversations that people were having by whether they actually either intended to or actually did vote for a Labour Party, Conservative Party, or not at all. So one important part of developing any methodology is considering its ethical implications, an area within which social media data have proved to be really disruptive. For us, this has meant going back to some of the basic principles, voluntary participation, which this presentation focuses on, minimizing harm, which links back to some of the stuff that Tarek was talking about around data security, and maximizing the value, and thinking about these holistically. So how do these three things all come together? Ensuring voluntary participation when using social media data and social research can be problematic, as researchers are not necessarily in direct contact with the human subject. However, as we're trying to collect the data of survey respondents we are in contact with, we're therefore in a position to try and collect informed consent. But our experiences of this so far has raised a couple of key challenges. As Tarek outlined, our previous research has found consent rates to be low, especially in web surveys, potentially introducing bias in the sample and reducing the statistical power. We're also asking people to consent to something which is quite complex. And this raises questions about how informed any of those choices really are. This project therefore aimed to improve our understanding of public attitudes to linking survey and Twitter data with the goal of improving our approach to collecting informed consent. To do so, we conducted 25 interviews with members of NatSen's research panel. These were purposefully sampled, most notably getting a mixture of people who had previously consented and previously refused consent when we'd asked previously in 2017. We used a mixture of techniques, firstly drawing on cognitive interviewing methods, running through our consent questions and asking participants to think aloud as they answer and probing them to ensure that they understood the wording and the terminology we were using. And that was followed up with a more in-depth interview to explore people's attitudes more broadly. The consent question we tested was based on the wording we previously used on the NatSen panel and the Understanding Society Innovation panel. So the stuff that Tarek showed you earlier. It was reviewed by the team with input from our colleagues and NatSen's ethics committee, but broadly aimed to do the same thing. So cover the key pieces of information we needed for informed consent, keep the wording broad to allow the data to be used for a range of purposes, and keep the information accessible to minimize the risk that people either just didn't read it or didn't understand it. The first part of the consent question, which is shown here, it was shown up front to all participants who reported having a Twitter account. And it aimed as simply as possible to cover some key points. Firstly, to give an indication of why we were collecting the data. Secondly, to give an indication of what we're planning to do with the data. Thirdly, to give some indication of what information we'll collect and that we will hold their data securely. And finally, that they will not be identifiable in any of the published outputs from the study. Since that is quite broad, alongside that, we provided a number of help links where participants, if they wanted to, could access additional information. I'm not going to show you the details here, but as Tarek pointed out, all of this detailed information is available in the various published papers we've published, and I've included a link at the bottom of the slide if people want to find that. So, as noted earlier, we split the fieldwork into 2 rounds to allow us to reflect on what was coming up in the interviews and, if necessary, update the design. So what did we find? Firstly, we found a lot of variation in people's preferences and levels of understanding. In general, we found most people had a basic understanding of what we were asking, and people felt confident in their choice. But the deeper discussions we had would identify knowledge gaps, throwing up the odd misconception or piece of lack of understanding. Some people felt there was too much information to absorb, even in this simplified form that we were trying to present it in. More information than they were willing, or more information than they were able to take in and process. Some people used none of the help links, while others read through all of the information in detail. Some also read some of them, either looking for specific pieces of information to address questions they had, or aiming to read all of them and sort of just giving up partway through the process. Another theme that came up, and the previous research we have conducted into attitudes to social media research more generally, was that people were unsure of how or why the data was of interest to researchers, and therefore why we were asking for it. In addition, they expressed concerns about being misrepresented, that their online persona, what they had said in the past, who they might follow, might not really be a true reflection of who they really are. And a final theme that came out was that people didn't necessarily focus on or weren't really concerned about the areas we wanted them to be. Perhaps given our ethical framework, one of the focuses that we have is on the security of data and the potential risk that comes with Twitter data making the linked survey data attributable to an individual. But the participants who we interviewed did not focus on this, perhaps partially as a result of being used to trusting that type of data with NatSen, so we hold their names already, or perhaps because of the complexity of understanding what data linkage really is and how it can make data identifiable. Instead, participants tend to focus on the sharing of Twitter data in isolation and focused on privacy rather than security. They expressed concern about more people and people who would be outside of their expected audience looking at their Twitter content, in particular with certain types of information. For example, images of their children got mentioned by a few people. So following these initial interviews, we decided to make some changes to the consent wording ahead of our second round of testing. The first thing we did more broadly was to try and cut any superfluous text as much as possible, focusing us onto key messages and making it less daunting to read and reduce the risk of people just skimming through the question. A more substantial change was to include an example of how the data might be used. While it was still quite general, this aimed to make it clearer why researchers might want to link respondent survey data and their Twitter data, and how the data could be useful to researchers. It also aimed to focus people's minds a little more on the fact they were being asked for consent to link the data and not simply for us to collect it. Another more substantial change was to move the help links off of the consent question page. Instead, respondents were asked explicitly if they would like more information. If they then selected that answer option, they were taken through to another page where all of the help links were presented to them. Again, the purpose of this was to reduce the amount of text on the page, so those who were less willing to engage might be more likely to read the key messages, while those who wanted the detail and wanted more information still had the opportunity available to them. By moving the help links for those who did want more information, we felt a little bit less constrained about putting too much information on the screen by having a very long list of links. And so we therefore added a few more. These specifically addressed the concerns expressed by participants about the utility of Twitter information or whether or not it represents the real them. It also made the information about how long the data will be collected and stored for more prominent, as this was a common misconception and something that both respondents and we felt was important to be able to give an informed decision. So, what were some of the initial themes coming out of the data after we completed all of the interviews and spent a little bit more time analysing the data? Even after the changes were made, we found that no participants really fully understood what it was that they were consenting to. Most had a basic understanding, but there was always something that they hadn't read, had forgotten, or had misunderstood. And it seems that because we're asking participants to process a lot of complex information and make a decision relatively quickly, they're therefore taking cognitive shortcuts when making their decisions. And I think as a researcher, these themes are a little worrying and certainly not ideal when we're talking about collecting informed consent. However, it is also worth noting and reassuring that when we asked people, none of the participants wanted to change their answers after we had that more detailed discussion about their choice and through the details in a lot more detail. So the shortcuts that we found people making were generally based around 4 themes. Firstly, what were the risks of consenting? This covered things like concerns about being misrepresented, feelings of intrusion, having their profiles viewed by people outside of their normal audience, and of their personal data being passed on for commercial purposes. Secondly, what were the benefits of taking part? And again, this generally followed themes along the lines of their reasons for taking part in social research and survey research more general, providing better information for the researchers, that the information was being used for the betterment of society and informing policy. Next, do they trust the organisation to hold the data securely and to use it for a purpose that they approve of? This is a key driver for many of the consenters, and perhaps reflecting that the sample we were interviewing were part of a panel sample, and so had already been used to providing this information. People tended to report being trusting of NatSen, but they also said that they would be of universities, but were more concerned that, for example, charities might use that information to target them for try and get money out of them, or commercial organizations might not use it for a positive purpose or what they considered a positive purpose. And finally, in the absence of trust, how much control do they have of the data? So how long would it be held for? Can they control what is accessed, and can they withdraw consent? These 4 themes mapped onto broadly 3 different types of respondents. The benefits of consenting were present for all, But people who were minded to consent focused mostly on their trust in that sense to manage the data responsibly and use it for a purpose that they would approve of. This group of people also often didn't view consenting as a high-risk activity for them, for example, because they already curated their online persona and their online presence. In contrast, non-consenters were more likely to focus on the risks, irrespective of how much trust they had in the organizations or the people asking for consent. They were unlikely to consent because not sharing data is their default position whenever they're asked for something like that. Finally, conditional consenters expressed a willingness to consent if they had sufficient control over the process. Interestingly, we didn't find any clear socio-demographic patterns for any of these groups, but it was a small qualitative sample, so we can't be sure if that would be true for a larger population. Participants had different preferences for accessing the information and how it was presented. This depended often on how they were making their decision. For example, a consenter who was making a decision based on a trust heuristic may not want to see lots of information, but conditional consenters who were making their decisions based on what they could or could not control might be much more wanting to see more information. But in general, people like that they could access the information even if they didn't end up doing so themselves. However, while some people were choosing not to engage, there were also some people who were not realizing that that additional information could be accessed, not realizing that they could click on the help links, or not realizing that they could select the answer option that would allow them to access additional information. So, in conclusion, for now, these initial findings raise some really interesting challenges for us as researchers. Simply presenting information and trying to make it accessible may not be sufficient to ensure what you might call fully informed consent. Asking people to process so much information so quickly leads to some of them using heuristic decision-making processes. And this makes me wonder, what is the ethical researcher's responsibility here? Are we attempting to enforce an informed decision, really making people read the information and demonstrate an understanding? Or is our responsibility to provide the information, but then respect respondents' agency in how they make a decision about consenting or not? Also, how do we reconcile the different respondent preferences in what information is provided and how? We cannot know upfront whether an individual wants lots of information or doesn't. We're still discussing these and other issues, but to give some initial thoughts, we do want to continue to keep the question as accessible as possible. And I think in general, I would rather to have more people making the decision with a basic understanding than a few people making it with a deep understanding and everybody else disengaging from the information we're providing. That said, in the latest version of this that we're working on, we have added in some small pieces of extra text. So for example, mentioning GDPR when we're talking about data security and being more explicit about when we will be collecting the data their data in the future as well. But that detailed information, even if we do just have the summary, must still be present for those people who want it and easily accessed. As I noted, we had some participants not realize there was more information to see, and we've been updating the layout to try and make this clearer, putting the option for more information in bold, for example, and pushing it above the choices of consenting or not to try and encourage people to see it and use it if they want to. Finally, if we accept that some people will make a decision to consent based on trusting us as researchers, then it means that it is our responsibility to repay that trust. And this links back to the initial principles I mentioned at the start of this presentation. If people are trusting us to process their data responsibly, then we need to make sure that our processes minimize the risk of harm to them. And if people are trusting us to use this information in a beneficial way, then we need to make sure that we have appropriate justification for collecting and using these data, and not just doing so because we can. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.